The tragic story of Leiliana Wright, a vibrant little girl whose life was brutally cut short by the very people meant to protect her, has left an indelible mark on everyone who has heard it. The paramedic who fought desperately to save her described the haunting memory of her cold, lifeless body as a heart-wrenching reminder of a life they could not save, a symbol of their unfulfilled mission to help. I must be honest with you. This is one of the most horrifying and emotionally devastating cases I have ever recounted. Before we proceed, I want to warn my sensitive viewers that this story is exceptionally difficult to hear. A mother's love has always been celebrated as one of the purest, most sacred bonds in existence. It represents nurturing, care, and an unyielding shield against harm. Yet, in this case, that sacred bond was twisted into something unrecognizably dark, unthinkable cruelty, and an utter disregard for the life of her own child. Leiliana Wright's story is not just about one little girl's suffering. It is a somber reflection of a system that failed her and countless others like her. Leiliana Wright entered this world on January 22, 2012 in Galveston, Texas, under less than ideal circumstances. Her mother, Jeri Quesada, was serving a 6-year prison sentence for burglary and gave birth to Leiliana in the prison hospital. The little girl's father, Brian Maker, was also unable to care for her, leaving her future uncertain from the start. 2 days after her birth, Leiliana was placed into the care of her paternal grandparents, Elise and Craig Clackley. Despite the difficult circumstances surrounding her arrival, the Clackleys took Leiliana in with open arms, raising her as their own and giving her a life filled with love and warmth. Leiliana was a happy, playful child with an infectious laugh that could light up any room. She adored singing, dancing, and spending time with the chickens her grandparents raised in their backyard. Her favorite song, 10 Little Monkeys Jumping on the Bed, was often heard echoing throughout the Clackley home, a testament to her boundless energy and cheerful nature. Though not biologically related to Jeri Quesada, the Clackleys treated her with compassion, often taking Leiliana to visit her mother in prison. They even supported Jeri financially, sending money to her prison account so she could buy essentials from the commissary. This generosity was remarkable, considering the complicated family dynamics. For the first years of her life, Leiliana thrived in the Clackleys' care. Their home was more than just a safe haven. It was a place where she could experience a happy childhood, surrounded by love and security. The Clackleys treated Leiliana more like a daughter than a granddaughter, cherishing every moment with her and doing their best to give her the life she deserved. However, as we'll soon uncover, this idyllic period of Leiliana's life was not to last. A tragic series of events would ultimately lead her back into the hands of her biological mother, a decision that would have devastating consequences. Unfortunately, Leiliana's stable and loving life with her grandparents did not last. In December 2013, when she was just 2 years old, her mother, Jeri Quesada, was released early from prison on bail. Upon her release, Jeri immediately reclaimed custody of Leiliana, stripping the Clackleys of their rights. This abrupt transition marked the beginning of a dark and uncertain chapter in Leiliana's life. Jeri was not only a convicted criminal, but also struggled with substance dependency. Her older children had long been removed from her care by Child Protective Services, CPS, and she had not been granted custody rights for many years. Those children were safely living with their father, far removed from Jeri's tumultuous influence. Jeri's troubled history painted a stark picture. In 2007, she was arrested in Illinois following a domestic incident, prompting CPS to launch an investigation into battery and neglect. The following year, she faced further charges for driving with an open bottle of alcohol in her car and for possession of illegal substances. By 2010, a judge in Illinois formally terminated Jeri's parental rights after years of instability, and she was incarcerated for burglary, the sentence she was serving when Leiliana was born. Despite her documented history of neglect and substance abuse, Jeri was somehow able to regain custody of Leiliana shortly after her release. Tragically, this decision would undo the safety and security the Clackleys had worked so hard to provide. Life with Jeri was far from nurturing. Shortly after regaining custody of Leiliana, Jeri became pregnant again. In October 2014, she gave birth to another child, further complicating her ability to care for Leiliana. This new addition to the family only added strain to an already unstable household. Jeri's irresponsibility and poor choices continued to cast a shadow over Leiliana's life. For the first 5 or 6 months after Jeri regained custody, Leiliana occasionally visited her grandparents. These visits were a rare reprieve for the little girl, who felt safe and happy in the Clackleys' loving home. But every time she had to return to her mother, Leiliana would cry and throw tantrums, clinging desperately to the stability she once knew. Gradually, these visits became less frequent, leaving Leiliana increasingly isolated from the care and love of her grandparents. On October 20th, 2014, Child Protective Services, CPS, received a troubling report concerning Leiliana's newborn brother, who was just 6 days old. The report revealed that the infant had been born with odds in his system, as Jeri had continued using illegal substances throughout her pregnancy. Less than a month later, on November 9th, another alert was raised, this time involving both Leiliana and her baby brother. During a routine traffic stop, Jeri was found in possession of Zao. Shockingly, Leiliana was in the car with her at the time. CPS intervened and temporarily transferred custody of Leiliana to Jeri's then-boyfriend, who was also the father of her younger brother. However, this decision proved catastrophic. The man was far from a suitable guardian. He had a history of criminal convictions and was notorious for his uncontrollable temper. He was known to have physically assaulted not only Jeri, but even his own mother. For Leiliana, life in this environment was a nightmare. The toxic combination of Jeri's neglect and her boyfriend's violent tendencies set the stage for an unimaginable tragedy. However, the children's time living with Jeri's boyfriend was mercifully short. A few days after being placed under his care, they were relocated to live with the boyfriend's relatives on his father's side. This change occurred because the boyfriend himself had been arrested on charges of sexual assault, a harrowing revelation that underscored just how unstable and dangerous their situation was. After weeks of upheaval, Leiliana was finally sent back to her paternal grandparents, Elise and Craig Clackley. This time, they were determined to secure her safety. Understanding the grave risks Leiliana faced in her mother's care, the Clackleys filed an official application for custody. In the application, Elise wrote passionately about her granddaughter's deteriorating well-being. Leiliana's emotional state is very bad. She needs to be taken out of this dangerous environment. I beg the court to protect our granddaughter from the horrors she is enduring. Elise also detailed Jeri's continued substance abuse, stating that it often occurred in the presence of both children. The Clackleys hoped their pleas would spur the court to act decisively. Unfortunately, Jeri's November arrest for possession of substances resulted in only a brief stint behind bars, just a few weeks. Upon her release, she moved into her mother's house and regained custody of Leiliana. Despite the Clackleys' tireless efforts, Jeri was able to maintain custody. The grandparents were permitted to see their granddaughter only twice a month under a court agreement. Meanwhile, representatives from Child Protective Services, CPS, began conducting monthly visits to the home where Jeri lived with Leiliana and her younger brother. On February 23, 2015, Leiliana's grandmother raised urgent concerns with a Child Protective Services, CPS, worker. She reported that during a recent visit, Leiliana arrived with visible marks on her face and an injured lip. The sight of her granddaughter in such a condition alarmed Elise deeply. In response, the CPS worker called Leiliana directly to discuss the injuries. During their conversation, the little girl revealed the heartbreaking truth. Her mother had caused the marks on her face. To support their claim, the Clackleys sent CPS photos that clearly showed evidence of the abuse. The following day, a CPS worker visited the home where Leiliana was living with Jeri and her mother. When questioned about the situation, Leiliana once again bravely confirmed that her mother had struck her in the face. However, Jeri and her mother categorically denied harming the child, attempting to dismiss the accusations as baseless. Despite the evidence, the system seemed reluctant to intervene decisively. Both Jeri and her mother claimed that Leiliana was an exceptionally clumsy child who constantly bumped into things. They insisted that the marks on her face and her split lip were simply the result of accidents. During a follow-up interview with CPS, Leiliana echoed this explanation, saying she had accidentally run into a wall, causing her lip to split. However, it's hard to ignore the timing. This conversation took place well after the initial visit, raising suspicions that the child had been coerced into changing her story. It's likely her mother had instructed her to lie and hide the truth, as the version of events suddenly shifted. On April 3, 2015, CPS closed their investigation, ruling out any abuse. This decision came despite significant red flags, including a chilling description from Jeri's mother about Leiliana's behavior. The woman described her granddaughter as unusually timid and fearful. According to her, Leiliana was a quiet, withdrawn child who often silently pointed at objects she wanted, rather than asking for them aloud. The system's inability to act decisively and protect Leiliana left her vulnerable, setting the stage for even greater tragedy. Leiliana's fearfulness extended beyond the usual timid behavior of a young child. She was visibly afraid of loud or sudden noises and wouldn't leave her room without explicit permission. This unusual behavior painted a troubling picture, yet it did not trigger intervention. In September 2015, Jeri moved with Leiliana and her younger brother to live with a new boyfriend, Charles Phifer, in a house in Grand Prairie. The home had previously belonged to Jeri's late grandmother, and now it became the children's new and unsettling environment. Their time living together was short-lived, however. After a few months, Jeri returned with her children to her mother Adelina's house. But her relationship with Charles didn't end there. Jeri continued to visit him regularly, drawn by their shared dependency on illicit substances. Charles Pfeiffer was no stranger to the attention of Child Protective Services. His record included troubling incidents from both New Mexico and Texas. In 2003 and 2005, he faced accusations of child neglect and physical abuse during domestic disputes. Though these allegations were never substantiated, the pattern was disturbing. In 2011, CPS removed Charles's daughter from his custody due to concerns about her safety. The child was eventually placed for adoption, cutting her ties with him permanently. This, along with Charles's ongoing struggles with dependency, painted a clear picture of someone unfit to be around children. Despite the danger he posed, Jeri knowingly brought Charles into her children's lives. This decision set the stage for a series of events that would escalate the already precarious situation for Leiliana and her younger brother. In January 2016, Child Protective Services received yet another report about Jeri's treatment of her children. This time, the concerns were even more alarming. The report detailed allegations of physical misconduct, inappropriate contact, and negligent care. It also mentioned another family member as the possible perpetrator, though their name was not disclosed. CPS workers made several attempts to visit the family and investigate the allegations. It wasn't until February 9, 2016, that they finally managed to meet with Jeri. Predictably, she denied any wrongdoing, painting herself as a caring mother. However, the social workers couldn't ignore what they saw. Leiliana had a purple bruise under her left eye, another older bruise under her right eye, and an old mark on her arm. Each injury told a story of potential harm and neglect, but Jeri dismissed them all with rehearsed excuses. According to Jeri, the bruise under Leiliana's right eye, despite already healing, had inexplicably been there for over a year, supposedly caused when the girl bumped into a table. She claimed the purple bruise under Leiliana's left eye was the result of the child falling during a tantrum. As for the bruise on her arm, Jeri attributed it to a friend she had asked to babysit Leiliana. That friend, it would later be revealed, was none other than Charles Phifer, her abusive boyfriend. When the social workers asked Leiliana directly about her injuries, the little girl hesitated. She claimed she couldn't remember how the bruises appeared, an answer that raised more questions than it answered. Instead of owning up to the concerns, Jeri deflected attention by accusing another family member of indecent acts toward Leiliana. The claim prompted Child Protective Services to issue clear directives. Jeri was to cease all contact between Leiliana and the accused relative. Additionally, she was forbidden from allowing her daughter near the friend who had left the bruise on her arm, Charles Pfeiffer. Jeri readily agreed to comply, offering reassurances to the social workers. But, as had become her pattern, her promises were empty. She blatantly ignored the requirements, allowing both individuals continued access to Leiliana. On February 17, 2016, amidst growing evidence of danger, CPS filed an official application for intervention. The document noted a high likelihood of removing the children from Jeri's custody due to persistent concerns about abuse and neglect. But tragically, that action came too late. The system faltered, and Leiliana remained in harm's way. Subsequent attempts to reach the family were fruitless. They avoided contact, evading any oversight. Then, just weeks later, on March 13, 2016, came the report that would end all further investigations. Leiliana Wright, at only 4 years old, was dead. Shortly after midnight, Grand Prairie police were dispatched to a medical emergency at the home that once belonged to Jeri's late grandmother. Leiliana had been left in Charles Pfeiffer's care, and what authorities discovered upon arrival was harrowing. The lifeless body of 4-year-old Leiliana lay before them. Her small frame bore the horrifying evidence of unimaginable abuse. Bruises covered 75% of her face, one eye so swollen it was impossible she could have seen through it. Deep, raw marks on her wrists indicated she had been restrained. The child's body was cold, her life already stolen by unspeakable violence. Jeri tried to spin a story of innocence, claiming Leiliana had merely slipped in the shower. But her narrative didn't match the devastation written across her daughter's body. Despite her attempt to appear distraught, Jeri's behavior only raised further suspicions when she requested to accompany her daughter to the hospital. Paramedics denied her request, stating she and Charles needed to remain at the scene to speak with investigators. For one medic, the sight of Leiliana's broken body was too much to bear. Unable to wait for standard protocol, he acted instinctively. He gently scooped the little girl into his arms, bypassing the stretcher altogether, and carried her outside. With a voice trembling with urgency, he commanded his team to move without delay. Leaving the ambulance doors ajar and its headlights illuminating the darkness, the paramedics sped toward Arlington Medical Center. Every second mattered, though deep down, they feared they were already too late. Despite the best efforts of the medical team at Arlington Medical Center, Leiliana Wright was pronounced dead on March 13, 2016, after 30 agonizing minutes of attempted resuscitation. The loss was devastating, not only to the hospital staff who fought to save her, but also to the police officers who had rushed to the scene. Outside the emergency ward, silence hung heavy as officers and medics struggled to process what they had witnessed. Some wiped away tears, unable to contain their grief. Sergeant Brad McAvoy, a seasoned officer with the Grand Prairie Police Department, later admitted, "This is the most horrific thing I've seen in my entire career." An autopsy revealed the extent of Leiliana's suffering. The 4-year-old had endured unimaginable pain, with the cause of death determined to be blunt force trauma. The injuries were not limited to her head. Her abdomen bore devastating damage, with evidence suggesting she had been struck or kicked with such force that her abdominal wall was pressed against her spine. As if this weren't horrifying enough, the medical examiner also documented signs of violations of an intimate nature, details that shocked even the most experienced investigators. Meanwhile, back at the scene, police questioned Jeri Quesada and Charles Phifer. Jeri was erratic, her behavior swinging between hysteria and incoherence, making it difficult for officers to get clear answers. Her words were fragmented, and her actions raised more questions than they answered. Charles, on the other hand, displayed a chilling calmness. While Jeri appeared distraught, whether out of guilt, fear, or grief, it was Charles's lack of emotion that unnerved investigators. His demeanor was detached, almost robotic, as though the gravity of the situation barely registered with him. By the time investigators began questioning Jeri and Charles, The couple had already rehearsed a fabricated story to explain Leiliana's condition. They claimed that Leiliana had spent the past 2 days at a friend's house in Oak Hill. According to their version, she returned home covered in bruises, which they alleged were inflicted by the friend's older sister. After sharing this dubious account, Jeri requested to speak with one of the officers privately. Agreeing to her request, the officer escorted her to his patrol car, where Jeri's composure began to crack. Away from Charles and under the weight of the investigation, she finally revealed the horrifying truth about what had happened to her daughter that night. Jeri confessed that she was terrified of Charles. Over the days leading up to Leiliana's death, Jeri admitted to growing increasingly frustrated with her daughter's behavior. She described Leiliana as misbehaving and being rude. The little girl, who was visibly unwell, had been vomiting frequently and refusing to eat. In a text message uncovered by the police, Jeri had written to Charles, expressing her belief that Leiliana was pretending to vomit for attention. What followed was nothing short of unspeakable. Fueled by substance abuse and their own frustration, Jeri and Charles decided to discipline Leiliana. Throughout the day, they took turns whipping her with a bamboo stick and a belt. Jeri admitted that they targeted her out of annoyance, perceiving her illness as a deliberate attempt to seek attention. As Jeri detailed the events, the reality of Leiliana's final hours began to emerge. The abuse she suffered was not a single moment of rage. It was a prolonged and calculated assault, stretching over hours and leaving her small body broken and bruised. On March 12th, Jeri visited Charles, and the pair continued their pattern of substance abuse. After injecting together, Jeri left to run errands, taking her younger son to her mother's house. This time, however, she made the decision to leave Leiliana with Charles. Jeri later explained her reasoning. The girl was so badly bruised that she could not be seen in public. Jeri returned around 3:30 p.m. with an oral rehydration solution for Leiliana. According to her, everything appeared fine at that moment. Leiliana was watching television, though under duress. Charles had forced her to stand as punishment for vomiting earlier in the day. Completely unfazed, Jeri indulged in her dependency once again before heading to her mother's house to nap. Later, Jeri called Charles to check on Leiliana. He assured her that the girl was fine, so Jeri continued her evening by going out to dinner at a steakhouse in Arlington with her younger son and parents. After the meal, sometime between 9:00 and 9:30 p.m., Jeri brought Leiliana back to her grandmother's house and put her to bed. She then hurried back to Charles to resume their substance abuse. When Jeri arrived, she didn't inquire about her daughter's whereabouts. Instead, she immediately joined Charles in the bathroom to satisfy their addiction. Only afterward did it occur to her to ask about Leiliana. Jeri asked Charles where the child was. His response: "She's sitting in the pantry." When Charles opened the pantry door, Jeri was met with a horrifying sight. Leiliana's hands were tied behind her back with an electrical cord. The little girl was bent at the waist, hanging on a rod so that her feet couldn't touch the ground. Something was tightly wrapped around her stomach. Fresh marks were visible on her face. Jeri ordered Charles to free her daughter, which he did. According to Jeri, Leiliana was still conscious and weakly said, "I love you, Mommy." Jeri brought her to the kitchen and tried to feed her a peanut butter sandwich, but Leiliana struggled to eat. Charles, enraged, dismissed her condition as an act of attention-seeking. He put on gloves, grabbed the child by the face, and began force-feeding her oral rehydration solution. Leiliana silently endured the ordeal, standing beside her mother. When she vomited again, Charles snapped. He grabbed Leiliana by the throat, lifting her off the ground with one hand, and then hurled her against the drywall, leaving a visible dent. Afterward, he shoved her back into the pantry and slammed the door. Later, when Charles pulled her out again, Leiliana was soaked and covered in vomit. Seeing her condition, Jeri decided to bathe her. Before bathing Leiliana, Jeri went to get clean clothes for her daughter. It was then that she heard Charles yelling something at the girl in the bathroom. Moments later, Charles stormed out, and Jeri heard a thud as Leiliana fell in the bathtub. Jeri rushed into the bathroom, where she began wiping and dressing her daughter. Suddenly, Leiliana fainted in her arms. Panicked, Jeri attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and demanded Charles call an ambulance. Charles initially dismissed her plea, claiming Leiliana was pretending. Jeri insisted, pointing out the girl wasn't breathing. Only then did Charles finally dial 911. During the call, Charles told the dispatcher that the child was having trouble breathing. The dispatcher provided instructions to assist the girl until the ambulance arrived, but Charles appeared not to follow them or communicate them to Jeri. After recounting these events to the police, Jeri inquired about her daughter's condition. The detective informed her that Leiliana had died. During further interrogations, Jeri admitted to her history of abuse, including kicking Leiliana, hitting her in the chest, slapping her, and punishing her with a belt and bamboo stick for not eating. Jeri Quesada, then 30 years old, was arrested and charged with felony child abuse. The court set Jeri Quesada's bail at $500,000. Just days later, Charles Pfeiffer was also arrested on the same charges, but his bail was set at $1 million, double Jeri's amount. Following his mother's arrest, Leiliana's younger brother was placed in foster care. In 2016, prior to the trial, Charles Phifer gave an interview, despite his lawyer's strong advice against it. His statements during the interview were a mix of absurd claims and outright falsehoods. Charles alleged that during his time living with Jeri, he witnessed her hit Leiliana twice. He claimed that the girl was afraid of her mother and obeyed her every command to avoid incurring her wrath. When Charles reportedly confronted Jeri about her behavior, she supposedly told him to mind his own business. Trying to paint himself as compassionate, Charles stated he had been secretly in contact with the Clackley family, aiming to help them regain custody of Leiliana. However, he claimed he kept this hidden from Jeri, fearing her reaction and the possibility of losing his place to live. Most of his statements were widely doubted, with perhaps only a fraction, if any, being truthful. In July 2017, Jeri Quesada accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to felony child abuse. Under the plea agreement, Jeri Quesada was required to testify against Charles Pfeiffer at his trial. Subsequently, she was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Reflecting on her actions, Jeri stated, "I realized where I went wrong, but I didn't do it alone." She claimed that her decision to accept the plea deal was to seek justice for her daughter. In October 2018, the trial of 36-year-old Charles Pfeiffer commenced. Initially charged with child abuse, a grand jury later elevated the charges to intentional murder. The prosecution presented a robust case, calling witnesses that included Jeri, her mother, emergency responders, investigators, and medical professionals. Each testified about the horrific abuse Leiliana endured and the events leading to her death. Charles chose not to testify in his defense, and his lawyer did not summon any witnesses. Instead, the defense strategy hinged on discrediting Jeri's testimony, painting her as an unreliable and self-serving witness. However, the prosecution delivered damning evidence. DNA analysis revealed Leiliana's genetic material under Charles's fingernails. Furthermore, her DNA was found on a glove, a key item corroborating Jeri's account of how Charles mistreated the child. Traces of Leiliana were also found on the broken drywall, consistent with Jeri's claim that Charles had thrown the child against it. When jurors were shown photographs of Leiliana's body, documenting the extensive injuries she suffered, they were visibly shaken. The images revealed deep marks on her wrists from restraints and multiple injuries across her back and other parts of her body. Medical examiners testified that they identified at least 12 distinct injuries on Leiliana's body, though they believed there were likely more. The overlapping injuries painted a grim picture of prolonged and repeated abuse. Jeri Quesada, testifying under her plea agreement, recounted the events leading up to Leiliana's death. However, she admitted to being under the influence of illegal substances for much of that time. This admission gave Charles's defense attorneys an opening to attack her credibility, pointing out inconsistencies in her story. and suggesting she was shifting blame to save herself. She made a deal with the prosecution, naturally trying to exonerate herself, Charles's defense attorney argued. But the prosecution countered by emphasizing that while both Charles and Jeri were culpable in Leiliana's death, Charles bore the primary responsibility. The prosecutor presented corroborating evidence, including phone call logs, eyewitness testimonies, and receipts that aligned with Jeri's version of events. These pieces of evidence established that Charles had been alone with Leiliana for significant portions of the day and had the opportunity to inflict the injuries that led to her death. Records confirm that Jeri Quesada had been out of the house for most of the day leading up to Leiliana's death. However, at the time of her daughter's fatal injuries, Jeri was present. This detail left lingering doubts about her potential complicity in the murder. Before the jury announced its verdict, Brian Maker, Leiliana's biological father, gave an emotional victim impact statement. He recalled the last joyful moment he had with his daughter, taking her to see Santa Claus. "She was so happy, laughing and playing," he said, his voice trembling. "But when she saw your car, Jeri, she screamed, cried, and begged me not to let her go back to you." Directing his words toward Jeri, Brian continued, "You should have given her to me. I would have protected her. She didn't deserve what happened to her." Brian described how Leiliana's frightened voice haunted him in his nightmares. "I see her face every night," he said, tears streaming down his cheeks. "So many people loved her. My parents loved her. And we tried so hard to get her away from you. But it wasn't enough." In October 2018, the jury delivered its verdict. Charles Pfeiffer was found guilty of intentional murder. The conviction carried an automatic sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For reasons not disclosed in court, the district attorney chose not to pursue the death penalty, a decision that left some observers questioning whether justice had been fully served. When delivering the sentence, the presiding judge addressed Charles directly. "This is the most horrific case I have ever encountered in my career," the judge declared. "Life imprisonment is not enough of a punishment for what you have done to that little girl." Shortly afterward, the State Commission on Judicial Conduct issued a formal reprimand to the judge, citing his comments as undignified and tactless. Despite the reprimand, many in the courtroom and beyond felt his words reflected the anger and sorrow felt by all who had followed the case. Leiliana Wright's tragic death ignited widespread public outrage and placed intense scrutiny on Child Protective Services, CPS. The agency admitted that systemic failures and an overburdened system had allowed social workers to overlook the escalating signs of abuse. In response to the public outcry, swift actions were taken. The social worker and supervisor responsible for Leiliana's case were terminated, and one of the special investigators resigned voluntarily. Family and friends wore bright yellow t-shirts bearing the message, "Justice for this little girl who was brutally killed." Leiliana's story is a haunting reminder of the consequences of systemic neglect. Despite having relatives who loved her and actively sought custody, CPS failed to intervene when it mattered most. Instead, Leiliana was left in a home rife with cruelty and dependency, ultimately costing her life. Her death, which could have been prevented, has become a rallying cry for reform and accountability. Thank you to everyone who watched this video through to the end. Let us honor Leiliana's memory by advocating for changes that protect vulnerable children. May sweet Leiliana rest in peace.